Is this way of conducting capitalism, do you think, sustainable?
Which way of capitalism?
The non-inclusive.
No, I think by definition not. I don't think it's in crisis. I think that there wasn't a sense of immediate crisis at this gathering today, which was, as your report said, a huge gathering of some $30 trillion under management.
There were loads and loads of very wealthy people
there were. I think the problem is that it's not inclusive, and you can define that in lots of ways, but I think a powerful one is it's no longer that the rising tide is raising all boats. Basically, the rise in inequality means that people at the top are doing incredibly well, and lots of people further down are not. And so the traditional idea that when an economy grew and there was growth, that no longer is so much the case.
But capitalism, hasn't it, Charlie Mayfield, hasn't it always depended upon inequality?
So there was a recognition today that capitalism, it doesn't mean equality, that some inequality is inevitable out of capitalism.
And indeed necessary.
But there can also be a point you reach when it's excessive. And the point that was made repeatedly today is there are a lot of people feeling that it's got to a stage where income inequality has reached levels which are concerning. And there was a pretty good consensus. Yeah, I do think that's a worry. And then on top of that, another feature is that technology is changing the way the job market is working. Now, on the one hand, there are some people who are doing very, very well as a result of technology. They're able to do a lot more than they were before and be paid more for it. But there are some sort of middle order jobs that used to be good paying jobs which are being replaced by technology. And the risk is that what we're seeing is a workplace which is changing shape, and effectively people talk about the hollowing out of the workplace. And those two things together, I think, create a situation which is worrying and needs to be addressed.
And they're related, right? One of the reasons that the inequality is widening is because of the change in technology, which is basically rewarding people who have the skills to use that technology. And it means that the people who used to be able to, the mid-skilled level jobs, are being automated away. And so I think that the challenge is, how do you equip people, or one challenge is how do you equip people with the skills that they need to prosper in this fast-changing environment? And I think that's where Sir Charlie's doing lots of interesting stuff. Do you think about education? Do you think about training? You can waffle about inclusiveness, but I think there are very, very concrete issues to be addressed.
There is an awful lot of waffle.
Yeah, but you know,
what would inclusive capitalism look like in a way that we could recognise as being different?
You know, if you had a table of people, you'd have loads of different definitions. My one would be that the rising tide, that prosperity raises all boats. And that doesn't mean absolute equality, far from it. Of course we need some inequality. But that you do have people, workers gaining as well as shareholders, that everybody is improving somewhat.
What is the John Lewis model that we're always hearing about?
So that's very different to a lot of other businesses in the sense that we're owned by the people who work in the business.
So you don't have shareholders?
We have shareholders, but they work in the business. There's 90,000 people in the business who own the company. And the interesting thing about the partnership is it was founded a little bit less than 100 years ago, but as a response to perceived inequality of capitalism. And essentially it was about saying, let's have labour employing capital rather than the other way around.
But that isn't a model you can apply everywhere, is it?
No, it's not something that I think is going to work everywhere, but I do think there is an opportunity for employee ownership, and perhaps more than that, for different forms of ownership to play a bigger part in our economy. We've become very focused on the PLC, which will always be, I'm sure, the predominant form, but not the only one.
But the way that it's worked in most market economies like ours in the past has been that business does what it does, and government does what it can to attenuate some of the consequences of these disparities.
And there was a long time a view that the business of business is business, and the business of government is government. And to a certain degree, that's absolutely right. I think a lot of what's going on now is thinking about what should government be doing differently? And it's not always the case of more government is better, far from it. And what should business be doing differently? And actually, an advertorial here for something that Sir Charlie wrote, but it's really very good. And if you wanted a concrete definition of inclusive capitalism, he called it CEO, the conduct of business, education and training and ownership. You talked about ownership before, but I think education and training is really central. We've got this unbelievably fast changing world. It's changing as dramatically as it was in the first industrial revolution. And yet we have no radical change to our education system. We haven't radically rethought training. We have a whole generation of people who don't have the skills that they need to succeed in this fast changing world. And we need to be much bolder about how to change that.
So Charlie, what would you like government to do?
So, well, first of all, what I think we should acknowledge from today is it was business people basically coming together. There were no serving politicians there at all. And that in itself is important, because I think it's a recognition by business people that business needs to play a bigger part. What I'd like to see from government is, on the one hand, in principle, I think government can play a bigger role in acting as a convener. So rather than feeling it must always solve issues, there are actually ways it can engage with business people, and indeed others, to try and solve some of these big challenges. And an example of that would be education, to Zanny's point. So, you've seen over the last 10 or 15 years, most successful businesses have completely re-engineered the way they operate. You're seeing now that working lifetimes are going to be at least 20% longer, and the innovation cycle is turning much quicker than before. And yet we still persist with this view that education sort of takes place between the age of 5 and 21. It's just outdated. And so what I would love to see is a much greater porosity, a collaboration really, between the world of business and the world of education. And there are lots of opportunities, I think, for that to happen at lots of different levels.